The studio lights blazed down on the stage, brighter than the midday sun. Cameras whirred, their red recording dots glowing like watchful eyes. The set of the popular television show, Star Moments, was designed to dazzle. Velvet curtains framed the stage, and polished marble floors reflected every ray of light. Behind the judge's desk, 3 celebrity faces sat with perfectly poised smiles that often turned razor-sharp when it came to mocking contestants. Among the line of young, glamorous participants waiting in the wings, each wearing sparkling gowns or sharp tuxedos, stood an old woman. She wore a plain, faded cardigan, her gray hair tied in a loose bun. The stark difference between her and the rest of the contestants was so sharp, even the cameraman exchanged glances of disbelief. Her name was Margaret Holt, a retired schoolteacher who had lived a quiet life in a small town. She wasn't there for fame, nor for the grand prize money. She had walked onto this stage for a reason none of the audience, or even the judges, yet knew. As the host called her name, the crowd murmured. Some giggled openly. Margaret Holt? Age 71. The host announced dramatically, pausing for effect. The camera zoomed in on her wrinkled face, capturing every fine line, every shadow under her tired eyes. Margaret shuffled to the center of the stage, her steps slow but steady. She looked around at the audience, rows upon rows of strangers, their laughter already bubbling. She could feel the sting of mockery in the air, sharp, bitter, and heavy. One of the judges, a young pop star known for his arrogance, leaned into the microphone. "So, Mrs. Holt, tell us," he smirked. "What will you be performing today? A bedtime story?" The audience erupted in laughter. Margaret simply folded her hands and said, "I will be playing the piano." The laughter grew louder. Another judge, a glamorous actress with diamond earrings, rolled her eyes. "Oh, darling, that piano is twice your size. Do you think you can even reach the keys properly?" The old woman smiled faintly, as though she'd heard such remarks 1,000 times before. The host raised his eyebrows. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's give this brave lady a chance." He gestured toward the grand piano, glossy black, sitting in the corner of the stage. Its presence was commanding, like a beast waiting to be tamed. Margaret walked slowly toward it. Each step echoed louder than the last, as though the room itself was holding its breath. She sat down gently on the bench, adjusted her posture, and placed her trembling hands on the keys. "Anytime you're ready," the judge said mockingly, tapping his pen against the desk. The audience was restless. Some whispered bets. "She'll mess it up in the first 5 seconds." Others pulled out their phones, eager to capture a video of the disaster they were sure was about to unfold. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, the laughter, the whispers, the bright lights, all melted away. She remembered her childhood home, the old upright piano her father had bought secondhand, the endless nights she spent teaching herself melodies because they couldn't afford lessons. She remembered playing lullabies to her children, and later, when her husband passed, pouring her grief into the piano keys until dawn. Her hands stilled. And then, she began to play. The first notes rang out soft, almost fragile, like a whisper. But quickly, they gathered strength, rising and falling in waves of beauty. The melody wasn't simple. It was breathtakingly complex, weaving classical mastery with raw emotion. The crowd froze. Conversations stopped mid-word. The laughter died instantly. Margaret's fingers moved with a speed and precision no one expected. Wrinkles disappeared in the glow of her talent. She became ageless in that moment, not an old woman mocked by strangers, but a vessel of something divine. The camera zoomed in on the judges' faces. The arrogant pop star's smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. The actress dropped her pen, her mouth slightly open. The audience sat spellbound. Some even gasped, others clutched their chests as the music swelled, powerful enough to stir memories they didn't know they had. Minutes passed, yet time seemed to stand still. And then, just as suddenly as it began, Margaret struck the final note. The sound reverberated through the hall like a last heartbeat, leaving silence in its wake. No one moved. The silence was so thick, it was almost sacred. Then, a single clap broke it. One person in the back stood up, clapping slowly. Another followed. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. People stood on their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. The same crowd that mocked her now roared with respect. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys. Her eyes glistening with tears, she quickly blinked away. She stood, bowed slightly, and whispered only one word to herself. For him. But no one knew who him was. The host rushed onto the stage, his face flushed with excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed was unbelievable. Mrs. Holt, you have blown us away tonight. The camera cut back to the judges, who scrambled to cover their earlier mockery with praise. That was unexpected brilliance, the actress said awkwardly. You've clearly got hidden talent, the pop star muttered, avoiding her eyes. But Margaret didn't care about their words. She had played for a reason far beyond their shallow compliments. As she left the stage, whispers filled the air. Who is she, really? Where did she learn to play like that? There's something more to her story. And indeed, there was. Because outside the studio, in the shadowy corners beyond the cameras, a figure stood watching. A man in a dark suit, his face hidden, yet his eyes fixed on Margaret with intensity. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and said only one sentence. She's back. And this changes everything. The roar of applause still echoed in Margaret Holt's ears as she stepped off the stage. Backstage, crew members and young contestants stared at her as if she had suddenly transformed into a different being. A few whispered congratulations, others simply stared in awe. But Margaret, her hands still trembling from the performance, hardly noticed. She clutched her cardigan tighter around her and walked with purpose down the corridor. For everyone else, tonight had been a stunning surprise. For Margaret, it was something else entirely. A beginning. The hidden watcher. Outside the studio, the man in the dark suit leaned against a black car. He kept his face half hidden under the brim of his hat, but his posture betrayed tension. His phone call replayed in his head. She's back. And this changes everything. As the applause shook the studio walls, his jaw tightened. He had waited years for this moment, years to confirm whether the rumors were true, that the old woman who had disappeared from the music world decades ago was still alive, still capable of that power. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the lighter briefly revealing the scar that ran across his cheek. His eyes narrowed. She can't run from the past forever, he muttered. Margaret was approached almost immediately by the host, cameras still trailing behind. Mrs. Holt, that was incredible. Can you tell us, where did you learn to play like that? Margaret gave him the same faint smile she had given the judges earlier. I learned in the quiet of my own home. The host pressed on. But surely, you had professional training? That performance was on the level of concert pianists. Her eyes darkened for just a moment. Once upon a time, she whispered. But that was long ago. The cameras caught the glimmer of pain in her eyes, but the producers quickly cut away, not wanting to lose the upbeat tone of the show. The audience would only see triumph, not the shadows that followed her. Margaret excused herself and slipped into a quiet dressing room. She closed the door, locked it, and pressed her back against it. Her breaths came heavy now that she was alone. From her purse, she pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the surface creased, but the image was clear. A young Margaret, radiant, sitting at a piano beside a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. Her fingers trembled as she traced his face. It's been so long, Arthur, she whispered. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock. Sharp, deliberate. Not like the hurried knocks of stagehands. Margaret quickly hid the photograph back in her purse. Yes. A young woman entered, no older than 20, holding a notepad. She was one of the show's assistants. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. Mrs. Holt, that was breathtaking. I just had to say it. You were amazing. Margaret softened. Thank you, dear. The girl hesitated, then blurted out. Are you the same Margaret Holt who played in Vienna, in 1975? The old woman froze. For the briefest second, her mask slipped. The assistant gasped. It is you, isn't it? Margaret forced a small smile, though her eyes betrayed sorrow. Child, that name, that time, it belongs to another life. The girl opened her mouth to ask more, but before she could, another knock came. This one heavier. Stronger. Margaret's chest tightened. The assistant frowned. I'll get it. No. Margaret snapped, louder than intended. She softened her tone. No, please. Leave me now. The girl looked confused but obeyed, slipping out quickly. Margaret stood frozen. She knew who was on the other side before she even turned the knob. She opened the door. There he was, the man in the dark suit. Older, scarred, but unmistakable. Her voice trembled. Victor. Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He removed his hat, his scar catching the harsh dressing room light. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't have come back." Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't come back for them. I came back for me. For what was taken." Victor's lip curled into a cold smile. Still clinging to that fantasy? After all these years? Her eyes flared. "It was never a fantasy. You know what Arthur and I built. You know what you destroyed." The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Victor leaned closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Play all the pianos you like, Margaret. But don't forget, there are debts unpaid. And some ghosts don't stay buried." He left as abruptly as he'd entered, the door slamming behind him. Margaret sank into the chair, her heart pounding. Her fingers itched to play again, not for the audience, but to drown out the storm of memories crashing back. Meanwhile, in the studio control room, the producers replayed her performance again and again. One producer leaned forward, frowning. "Run that back. Zoom in on her hands." The footage showed Margaret's fingers flying over the keys with impossible precision. But more than that, there was something in the way she played. Something haunting, something almost otherworldly. Another producer whispered, "We've stumbled onto something big. She's not just a contestant. She's a story." Unbeknownst to them, outside the studio, Victor wasn't the only one watching. Another figure sat in a parked car, camera in hand, snapping photos of Margaret as she exited later that night. He muttered into his recorder, "Subject confirmed, Margaret Holt. Talent intact. Past connections, under review." That night, Margaret returned to her small apartment. She didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood by the window, looking out at the city, her reflection faint in the glass. She pulled the photograph from her purse again. Arthur's face stared back at her, frozen in time. "They think they can erase you," she whispered. "But I won't let them. Not anymore." She placed the photograph gently on the piano in her living room, an old, weathered instrument that had seen decades of her pain and practice. She sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play once more. This time, the music wasn't for the world. It was a message, a vow, carried through the notes into the night. And somewhere, miles away, another piano answered. That night, Margaret couldn't escape the haunting sound she had heard through her window. The faint piano notes had wrapped around her heart like a whisper from the past. She sat at her old instrument, pressing keys, trying to match the rhythm she thought she heard. It was impossible. Yet deep inside, she knew that style belonged to one man, Arthur. Sleep refused her. Instead, the night carried her back to Vienna, when she and Arthur played under golden lights. Their music wasn't just performance, it was conversation, love turned into melody. And then came the shadows, jealous men, power-hungry sponsors, and Victor. He had wanted control, and when Arthur refused, everything had been taken away. Arthur disappeared, and with him, the music of her soul. By morning, Margaret's eyes were hollow from tears. She rose slowly, only to find an envelope slipped under her door. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a torn piece of an old concert program, the very night in Vienna when she and Arthur had performed together. Along with it, a single line written in bold strokes, "The music never dies. Follow the notes." Her breath caught. Someone knew. Someone wanted her to continue. That evening, a sudden knock startled her. Fear tightened her chest. "Victor?" Carefully she opened the door, only to find the young assistant from the TV show. The girl looked pale, nervous, but determined. "I know who you are," the assistant whispered as she stepped inside. "And I know who Arthur Holt was." Margaret froze. the name trembling in the air. The girl set down a small device and pressed play. On the screen, in grainy footage, a man sat at a piano in a dim underground hall. His face was hidden by shadows, but the music, the style. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Arthur," she gasped. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the screen. After decades of silence, after years of burying her pain, the impossible truth broke through: Arthur was alive. The assistant leaned closer, her voice urgent. This video was recorded just 2 weeks ago. In a hidden club. A place where musicians are trapped, forced to play for those in power. I traced it to an address. I think he's there. Margaret's heart pounded louder than any music she had ever played. Hope and terror tangled inside her. That night, she and the assistant slipped into the narrow alleys of the city, following the trail. The streets grew darker, quieter. At the end of one alley stood a heavy steel door, dim light spilling from the cracks. From within, a faint melody drifted out, soft, broken, but alive. Margaret froze. Her eyes filled with tears. The sound was Arthur's. She knew it as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. Her trembling hand reached for the handle. But then, the echo of footsteps followed them. A car engine idled at the mouth of the alley. Shadows moved closer. Victor's men. The piano inside grew louder, desperate, almost calling her. Margaret's breath came in sharp gasps as she pressed her palm against the cold steel. "It's him," she whispered. "I can feel it." The moment stretched like eternity. Her hand tightened on the door. And the world went silent. The cold steel door beneath Margaret's trembling hand felt heavier than stone. For decades, she had lived without answers, haunted by melodies that had no ending. And now, just beyond this door, the faint rhythm of piano, Arthur's piano, beckoned her like a voice from the grave. The young assistant gripped her arm, whispering, "They are coming. We need to hurry." From the end of the alley, shadows stretched long and threatening. Victor's men were approaching, their footsteps sharp against the wet cobblestones. Margaret knew they had no time. With a burst of strength, she pulled the handle. The door groaned open, releasing a wave of music, raw, desperate, and painfully familiar. Inside, smoke from old cigarettes clouded the air. The dim underground club smelled of dust, liquor, and forgotten dreams. Dozens of figures sat hunched at tables, faces blurred in shadow, all watching a man at the piano under a single spotlight. Margaret froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Arthur. His hair was silver now, his shoulders bent with age, but his fingers danced across the keys with the same brilliance, the same fire she had fallen in love with. Every note bled with sorrow, but also with defiance. Her vision blurred as tears welled. She took one step forward, then another, until she was only a few feet away. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice breaking. The music faltered. His hands trembled on the keys. Slowly, the man turned. His eyes, tired, hollow, yet filled with recognition, locked onto hers. "Margaret." The piano's echo seemed to vanish, replaced by silence so deep it crushed the air. She covered her mouth, choking back sobs. Decades of loneliness collapsed in that single glance. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside him. "It's you. It's really you." Arthur lifted a trembling hand, touching her cheek as though afraid she would vanish. "They told me you were gone. They told me." But before he could finish, the steel door slammed open. Victor's men stormed inside, their faces hard, their eyes cold. The club's audience, mere shadows in the dark, quickly scattered like frightened birds. Victor himself entered last, dressed in a sharp black suit, his smirk slicing through the room like a blade. "Well," he drawled, clapping slowly. "The reunion we've all been waiting for. Touching, isn't it? But this story doesn't have a happy ending." Margaret rose to her feet, shielding Arthur with her frail frame. Her voice, though shaking, carried fire. "You destroyed our lives. You stole my husband. You think you can silence music, but music never dies." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "Music is power. And power belongs to those who control it. Arthur learned that the hard way. Didn't you, old friend?" Arthur's voice cracked with fury. "You turned me into your prisoner, Victor. You locked me in this tomb of sound. But you'll never own me. Not anymore. The young assistant, who had been silent until now, suddenly stepped forward. She raised her phone high, the screen glowing. "The world is watching," she declared. "I've been live streaming since we entered. Every word you've said is out there. Your crimes, your lies, your cruelty." Victor's smirk faltered. Arthur's weak laugh cut through the tension. "Your empire is built on fear. And fear dies when the truth is heard." Enraged, Victor lunged forward, grabbing Margaret by the wrist. "Enough," he roared. "If the world wants a performance, let them see this." But before he could strike, Arthur surged up from the piano bench. Despite his frail body, he shoved Victor back with all the strength he had left. Victor stumbled, crashing into the edge of the stage. The crowd that had begun creeping back inside gasped as the once untouchable tyrant lay sprawled, his composure shattered. Police sirens wailed in the distance. The assistant had already called for help. Victor's men fled into the shadows, abandoning him. His empire was crumbling, piece by piece. Arthur turned to Margaret, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with the same fire she remembered. "After all these years," he whispered, "I finally played for you again." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. "And I heard every note, Arthur. Every note." The police stormed the club, dragging Victor away in handcuffs. Cameras flashed as reporters poured in, capturing the extraordinary scene. But for Margaret and Arthur, the noise, the chaos, the flashing lights meant nothing. For them, only the quiet truth remained. Two souls reunited by music, their love surviving the cruelty of time. In the days that followed, the story swept across the world. The Hidden Symphony, they called it. News outlets replayed footage of Margaret and Arthur's reunion, their faces etched with decades of pain and joy. Audiences everywhere wept, not just for the tragedy, but for the triumph. And then came the night of their final performance. The concert hall was overflowing, every seat filled, every balcony crowded, every heart waiting. Margaret, now dressed not as a forgotten old woman but as the legendary pianist she had always been, walked slowly to the grand piano. Arthur was wheeled beside her, frail but alive, his fingers resting on the keys. The crowd rose in silence as they bowed together. For the first time in decades, husband and wife shared the stage. Margaret placed her hands on the piano. Arthur smiled at her, whispering, "One last time." And together, they played. The music was not flawless, their bodies were old, their hands stiff, but the emotion in every note transcended perfection. It was a symphony of survival, of love that endured chains and years, of truth louder than lies. By the final chord, the audience was no longer an audience. They were witnesses to history. Tears streamed down their faces. Applause thundered like a storm. Margaret turned to Arthur, her eyes glowing. "We did it." Arthur smiled faintly, his hand resting over hers. "We always did." The curtain fell. And with it, the final note of a love story that had refused to die. Broken heart ending message for audience, suitable for YouTube narration. Sometimes life tries to silence us, to bury our gifts, our love, our truth. But music, like love, never dies. Margaret and Arthur's final performance wasn't just a song. It was proof that no matter how much darkness tries to destroy, light will always return, in the end.